And we're recording. Give me a sound check, Daniel.
Hello.
Yes. Wow. And we're here with our keeper of minutes, Don.
Take a picture of them.
Our court register. Probably be in poor taste to send that to Dave.
There was a PSA. Yeah, it would be. That's why I was like, don't put it on Facebook. I don't know. Maybe you wouldn't mind. It says, are you? There's like a public service thing. It says, are you lonely, tired of working on your own, hate to make decisions? Hold a meeting. You can see people, show charts, feel important, point with a stick, eat donuts, impress your colleagues, all on company time. Meetings, the practical alternative to work.
So damn true.
It is. My theory is that meetings are actually organisms, because the sole purpose of organisms that can be proved to procreate, because the sole purpose of a meeting is to create other meetings.
Well, a lot of these programs that you see come out on an executive level from mid-tier management and executives are there for the sole purpose of them trying to justify and rationalize them actually having a job. Like they have nothing going on, so they have to justify the expense of $200,000, $400,000 a year.
That's what we're doing in my book. The guy's not like anti-capitalist in that book I was reading called Debt. He's not anti-capitalist, but he does say like capitalism, the top-down approach to capitalism is a weird fusion between communism in terms of the average workplace and top-down military-style approach to order sheets, which promotes stupidity at the top level and foot dragging at the bottom because people don't feel like they're being properly compensated. But he's talking about how, this is what I talked to you about before, he's talking about how basically everyone is essentially communistic in attitude. You know, other economists would have us say that every form of human transaction is supposed to be, what am I getting out of it? He says we don't act like that in regular life, we just don't.
Yeah.
He says when, for example, if I was to say, pass the wrench, you wouldn't say what's in it for me, you just pass me the wrench. That's a communistic opinion. That's not rare, that's not crazy, but he said it's like, what does he say, it's not reciprocity either. He says the idea that we're not doing it because what are you doing for me, it's the idea is I'm doing this for you because you would do this for me, not that you necessarily will. And we only ever extend that to our own small demographic. You wouldn't, he says, because what happens after that is a form of hierarchy in terms of when you, for example, if you were to give money to a homeless person, on a regular basis, it would be considered to be you would be considered a generous person because of your hierarchy, and they would accept that and not try to reciprocate. Well, why do we give money to homeless people? We're never going to get anything back from it, and we're not actually going to see any benefits to it in a societal way. He says it's because of the idea in our minds that it makes us feel good. Which cat is that?
It's either Wallace or Schmoop or one of Cheryl's cats.
The one with the little flask that you put on Facebook. That's like me when I was 22. Paddling a bottle of vodka. I love you so much. It's so good.
Alright. More wine.
Do you have vodka?
John is currently pointing at all the liquor that he has.
The Lush.
I am an alcoholic, but functional nonetheless.
But he said that I'm
Probably want a cup before you get ice. I'm pretty good at these things.
This one?
Yeah, well, whatever cup you'd like, sir.
He says that money, in its essence, is a very democratic ideal, because what it means is the difference between money and reciprocal exchange. Like, okay, so you and I'm having a drink on your dollar, essentially, right? But you don't look at it like I'm costing you money. You're just like, you're having a drink because I have it available. And that's a communistic approach. A lot of people hold that. That's nothing rare. You're not going to sit there and break that down and go, well, you've drank like, the total bottle was $25, you've drank this much, this is how much you owe me. And I might not see that exchange back, but I will on some level see that returned over time.
There's no, I'm going to give you an interest-free loan on that kind of thing. And that's, no, we don't think that way. But when we come to exchange goods, like he says, it's really interesting. He says that when we talk to one person to another person, there's this, all human transaction with money is a social engagement, right? Even when you go into Jewel Osco, people still pretend to be your friend, and they are instructed to talk to you like a human being and to joke with you. We don't haggle or anything like that. But even if you haggle, the principle of haggling is getting upset with someone on the basis that you're both kind of have this illusion of friendship, and you're upset that he would have ever asked something so insulting, and you would ever suggest something so insulting, and so that's why haggling is a little mini battle. You both argue over prices, and you go away feeling equal. But economic exchange, the markets don't form like that. When you approach someone with money and you have trade, like within a trade element, you go to some. Do you want ice?
I'll grab a nice cube in just a moment.
He says when you approach someone when you've got money and they have an item to bring, you both come to each other as equals, and you're both going to leave the situation never speaking to each other again. But the principal point of an economic arrangement is it's cleaned up at the end. Like, okay, if I was to come to you and I was like, you have $1 and I have a wine glass and you want to buy this, okay? So I approach this and I go, well, it's worth $1.10. And you'd be like, it's more of 90 cents. And the guy down the road, he's selling it for 80 cents. We're both engaging like in a social interaction. When you have communities with hundreds of thousands and millions strong, you can't be friends with everybody all the time. So that's where money comes in, he says anyway. He says, but that's just for economic transactions. Like regular day-to-day transactions are all communistic. And he's like, not communistic in terms of ideology, but communistic as in like working together as a group. He says, you separate property ownership from communism, and it's something we do every single day. Well, he says, nobody in their right mind would watch a child fall into train tracks and not rescue them. Why would they do that? What's the morality behind that? And the idea is that that's like something extended to a larger social group, that you would do it because you think someone would probably do it for you. You'd be considered monstrous if you didn't do it. This one?
Whichever one you'd like, sir.
Do you want me to use the one that's already open?
Sure.
Okay.
It was just open, so it's not really flat. You might even need to make some math. Yeah, I get that. One of the things that I actually, I just recently read an article, and forgive me for not committing my actual source to memory, but they were saying that one of the big downfalls of our economical system isn't necessarily people making lots of money. It's that people in this day and age are making mad amounts of money and contributing nothing to society. Like, as much as people might bitch and complain about Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, they really don't demonize them the same way they do bankers, because they're really, at the end of the day, if you're just pushing numbers around and just taking a large portion of or percentage of said numbers or money, then you're not really contributing anything to society like, say, Bill Gates or Steve Jobs did, who brought a lot of technology and civil advancement and technological advancement to our world as we know it.
Not to mention the massive amounts of philanthropy by Bill Gates. I mean, although on one hand he's a very shrewd and careful business person who will undercut anybody for anything, at the same time his Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is huge. I mean, his idea of ruling out, like in the same way, remember the polio vaccine? Where's the spoons? The polio vaccination?
Underneath that's fine.
The polio vaccinations, where we went out there with this idea that we were going to go out as a universal, as a civilization, and totally destroy polio. Was it polio? No, smallpox. We're going to go out there and destroy smallpox everywhere we find it, all across the world. We're just going to wipe it out. Like, that's the kind of intentions they have. They want to go out and wipe these things out for good. But because like governments are so useless these days, and because people feel like this sense of entitlement that why should my tax dollars go towards paying for things like this? I mean, to show how people don't want to do that kind of things. We rely on private philanthropists to do it for them, and I mean, people's understanding of what money means is so far detached. Like, it's so crazy. Both you and I know, like, when it comes to money, what money represents. We know that money is a representation of an object of some kind, of a debt that you're engaging in. But it's basically we're moving around debts provided to us, issued for interest by a bank of some kind. Someone actually said to me the other day, "We're like, I just don't get it. What's wrong with the system when a penny costs more to make than it does in value? As if a $5 bill is worth $5. It's like, it's symbolism. That's what it's for. It's to prevent. It's a means by which so you don't have to carry around your entire stockpile of whatever you do for a living around with you all the time and expect people to want it. Money is a symbolism, and money in itself isn't a bad thing. But I think you've hit the nail on the head. That I think what happens is when you virtualize currency to the extent that we have, and virtualized currency has always been the case. People have always done that. Money, a $5 bill is virtualized currency. It doesn't mean anything. When you virtualize the currency to the extent that way, when you start printing money that doesn't actually represent anything, that seems to be the massive downfall. That's the problem. It's not people making money. Making money is fine. Making money is okay. But it's when you start virtualizing it, moving it around, shifting it around, and deciding people's lives, deciding so much of society based on things that aren't fundamentally real. But
Well, and we've actually, since the period of Nixon, have been, all participating, every country, every single person on the planet, on a worldwide socio-economic experiment. Up into Nixon, we had some form or another of precious metal backing some sort of form of currency. Before World War II, everybody was expected to maintain their own reserves in any country, or any entity could call them out at any point in time saying, I have this amount of money, I want this amount of precious metals for the said money. And after World War II, we had all of these, we had the Great Depression, which, it seems directly associated largely in American culture around America, and a lot of people don't think that the Great Depression affected any other country but America, but it was a worldwide epidemic. A lot of countries, especially Britain, France, and stuff that, actually caught the fangs of the Reich, got hit a lot harder than any American body actually did. So one of the things that they did after World War I and World War II was they relied on the United States to actually go and back every world currency. The problem that we had is that not a lot of governments wanted to go and manufacture money to go and get the precious metals back out of the United States for the exchange rate, because if they put more money in circulation, you'd have inflation or hyperinflation, and it wouldn't work. But around the period of Nixon, more and more countries started saying, hey, United States, we want to go and change some money around. You are the big badass boys on the block. We need you to do this exchange rate. And we didn't have the precious metals to go and back this. Inflation had gotten so far out of perspective. So Nixon unhinged that cart.
It's funny you say that. There's something I read in that book which I really enjoyed. There's the little factoid, the Wizard of Oz, written by Frank L. Baum, was actually propaganda. And at the time, I forget the dates. I'm really sucky with dates. Like 1800 something or other. Like Frank. He wrote this thing. There was this idea that the Midwest farmers were trying to generate currency and jobs by means of unpinning the dollar, which was a big thing, that unpinning the dollar from precious metals and land. And the Wizard of Oz essentially is basically a parody of that, because what was going to happen was the politician representing the Midwest was going to go to New York and petition the president to talk about this. So Dorothy represents this politician. The yellow brick road is the money of gold all the way to going towards New York. The wizard himself represents the president, who has no real power whatsoever. I think it was like the Tin Man represents the industrialized man, who didn't have the heart to stand up in solidarity behind them. I think the lion represents the bankers, who didn't have the courage to do the same thing. The scarecrow represents the farmers themselves. And what was it? Wicked Witch of the East and West were the East and West bankers in New York and California. And on top of that, Oz is ounces. It's shorthand for ounces, which is gold, which is underpinning the whole thing.
Holy shit.
I know.
So the Wizard of Oz is an entire allegory for the whole financial system.
At that time, yeah.
Yeah.
In the 1800s. It was really fascinating to read it, but it's very similar to what you're talking about there in terms of like their struggle, the attempt to try and unpin it in that respect. But now we're just like...
Well, I think that without some sort of precious metal or commodity backing any world currency, it's impossible to be fiscally responsible. Especially now with, like, ever since 1913 or 1916, yeah, I get my dates a little bit screwed up too. Like the Federal Reserve Act.
I never remember freaking dates.
With, what was it, Andrew Wilson? I don't know.
Adam Smith?
No, Adam Smith was a preacher and who later became a major contributor and writer to all things capitalism and financial theory. But Woodrow Wilson, whatever president actually pushed through the Federal Reserve Act of 1916 or 1913. We're not citing ourselves on Wikipedia for those listening right now. We're sitting around a table drinking vodka, so fuck off. And
this is drunk economics.
Yes.
Neither of us any backing in either of those things. I read a book. I read a book. Watch documentaries. That's why we say, like, in the year 18, this guy came forward. Anyway, you were saying.
Right. But it's but ever since then, we brought up the Federal Reserve. It's impossible for us to actually pay off our debt, and all countries now are generally drawing off some sort of World Bank for that. If all money created, there's a percentage of interest charged on it to put it into circulation. The only place to get the money is the only place that also charges interest on it. Therefore, you can never create enough financial existence to pay back that to the Federal Reserve. Therefore, every country and every person will always perpetually be in debt. The system is inherently meant to consistently keep everyone in debt, and thereof, and hereby, and whereabout, and all those big fancy things right there.
But I think
money in reality is just a form of debt.
I think debt, to some extent, is the form by which we... That's how society works in many opinions. Not necessarily in terms of economic debt, though. Often in terms of obligation, social obligation debt, like that. I really feel like debt is the underpinning of every one of our things. Like, not a sense of you owe me, so I have to pay you back, but I have an obligation to you to assist you. Like, we have an obligation to our parents to... I mean, this is one of the interesting theories, was that we have an obligation to the gods way back when, in terms of our lives, and so we make sacrifices as interest payments. A small life in exchange for mine, and you only ever repay your debt when you die. As soon as you're born, you owe someone something. That's called like a primordial debt theory. But the British banking system apparently is formed on this idea that somewhere in 1700, a bunch of bankers got together and loaned £1.5 million, which is a ton of money back in those days, to the king, and secured that debt because the king was good for it. He would pay 8% a year, very good for the bankers. And on the basis of that debt, the bank would then have the ability to start coining currency. So they would start coining currency on that debt, which is why every single time you pick up a dollar bill or some sort of note, it says the debt paid to so-and-so. The debt circulates in that respect. So they could then start issuing interest-based loans and also currency on that basis, on that debt that was handled that was held by the banks. Now, that to this day stays in effect. And if that debt was ever paid back by the crown, the whole system would collapse. And that's how markets happen. You create a vacuum, the vacuum is filled in some respects. Like armies way back in ancient times, why would a king who owns all the mines give a shit about getting gold? Well, you don't have any markets. If you have a 10,000 person army, however, and you need to maintain that army, the best way of making sure that you're not responsible for maintaining that army is you pay the soldiers in gold, and then you tax the people in that same gold. And the people are like, oh, what the hell? What am I going to do? How am I going to get this gold? Well, who has the gold? The soldiers. How am I going to get that gold from the soldiers? Sell them things that they need. And in that moment, you generate markets. So you're like, well, you need shoes, and I sell shoes, and I need this gold because I need to pay this king in taxes. So then you generate markets. And then also, the genius of it is then you get to maintain your army without having to actually pay anything. You know, you still get to... And why would you tax them on it? And freaking British colonials did it for years. They called it the moral tax, the poll tax.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was to institute the idea of consumerism. Why would they coin money, give it to locals, and have them pay it back again? There's no point, right? But what the point is to get them to have money and then be able to use it to pay for small consumable items like cigarettes and umbrellas and things like that from Western cultures, to make them civilized, to understand the nature of debt. And that's how they try to civilize people.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I don't know where I'm going with that, but the point is...
No. I actually, it's not where you were going with it. It's where I wanted to go with it. I was actually looking up the original definition of robot, which I believe is the ability to do work or something of that nature, right? I could go and look it up, but it's literally automation of work or something like that, the tool doing the job of man. And one thing that no politician is really talking about, and I think that it affects us all, and it's expounding upon what you talked about, is what happens when you have, we need to create a vacuum and create existing markets. You have the soldiers who have the gold, and then you need the people to go and generate all the swords and shields and everything for said standing army. But what happens when you create a buffer of self-automated tools and you almost automate the whole manufacturing process so you can go and give those soldiers swords and shields and everything else, but you're still taxing the people as if they were going and doing it? And I think that that's really sort of what we're starting to see here. And it isn't even coming to fruition. And it's really to look at that, building on your example, where we're going from a socioeconomic perspective. It's sort of frightening, and
it is frightening. I like the word socioeconomic because I think socioeconomics are absolutely inseparable. I don't believe it's really interesting. One of the things that I think is society or institutions that we live in tell us that as soon as we're born, we are indebted to our people before us, society in general. You'll pay your debt to society is a really common thing. Because the idea is you owe them. You owe your parents, you owe society for the learning you get, you owe for them helping you out, you owe everybody. In a kind of manner of speaking, you kind of do. You do owe everybody. Nobody is an island. Everyone relies on everybody else to some extent. Even if it's teaching you the alphabet, someone came up with that. You have to pay them back. Whereas on the other hand, you've got the market. And the market says, you don't owe anybody anything. From the beginning, you sit and generate debt by being, when you start paying for things and not paying for things as well. It says you're equal. It says you're, and I use the term equal very loosely. I'm not saying equal in terms of a democratic way. I'm talking about, I have $5, you have $5 worth of stuff, let's exchange it, we both leave equal. You know, we're both left in the same thing. It's a democratizing process. That's totally different opinions. Society is saying you owe everything. Market saying you don't owe anything until you do, in which case it's monetary and you paid for something, and like you start accumulating that kind of stuff. And the idea is they're two separate things, but the word socioeconomic says no. The word socioeconomic is a powerful word because I think what it says is the two, it reveals the truth. The two are absolutely inseparable. There is no markets without the state, and there is no state without the markets. They need each other. And a state could be a religion, or it could be our societies and everything that we live. Like, what is a society? You could ask that the question too, but they are completely inseparable. Socioeconomic means they interact. All transactions are, and all business is a parody or an illusion or an element of human interaction. Which is, someone brought up a really good point today, like, well, what about online purchasing? You're not interacting with anybody at that point. But you are. Amazon makes you feel comfortable. It makes things convenient for you. A bit like if you go into a shopkeeper from, 500 years ago and you say, I need some bread, and the shopkeeper's like, oh, nice to see you, I saved your bread for you. Amazon does exactly the same. It replicates the same kind of social warmth that you might, or tries to replicate the same kind of social warmth that you get from your local shopkeeper. Oh, I noticed that you purchased this thing the other day. Have you considered these other things you might also like to purchase? And you're like, oh, thank you very much, Amazon, I would. You're not talking to a person, but we're fooled. I say fooled because it makes it seem like we're stupid, but we're coerced into thinking that it's like a similar kind of social warmth. And business, as what it is today, is a parody of that. It's a joke. It's conducted on totally different terms, but I mean, when you still get people taking out business partners to lunch because you want to help them do something, you still got that same kind of elements always been there. So when you say like socioeconomic changes and where it's going, wherever the markets are going is where people are going. Wherever the people are going is where the markets are going. The markets can never stray too far away from society because the markets depend on it.
Mm-hmm.
The market, the idea of a trading forum, can never separate away too far. I mean, look what happened when Wall Street went the way it did. Like, you've got the market separating out so far that it's fucking with people's lives, ruining livelihoods. Society frowns on it, stops taking interest loans. They have to change their image. They realize they make the mistake of believing they're separate to the people they rely on. They rely on them. The people rely on them. They forget that. That's their own folly. And they forgot about it. People started with like, well, whatever. And now why are people upset with the government? Because people are being incarcerated for these crimes that they did in terms of that? Because people realize, the average person on the street realizes, I gave you trust. And it's just the same as that model as for thousands of years. Here is this money that I've accumulated, chits or representation of currency that I have. And you know what? I'm going to give this to the bank to hold for me as a safe deposit thing. And what did they do with that? Today, I mean, they abused it, and I think that's why people are getting upset, and I think that's why were kind of ripe. I'm looking at the idea of being sort of like a communist stroke capitalist system, and kind of getting this idea in my head, just building up strength about this idea that the capitalism in and of itself isn't a bad thing. It's when that capitalism serves only itself and doesn't serve the people, in terms of, you know, like you said before, you said it perfectly, hedge funds and frickin' future planning, futures and things like that. The idea of buying and selling stuff that hasn't even grown yet.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like futures. You're separating it from the social element.
Absolutely.
And you can buy and sell money, make money really quickly on that, but that doesn't help you when that harvest fails, and you get a really shitty year, and all of a sudden everything that you've just sold off doesn't worth anything anymore. You're like, I will guarantee to you, 500 tons of this thing, and that 500 tons doesn't turn up. It doesn't matter to you. You've already made your money. But the person who's the farmer who's doing that, his stock's now worth almost nothing. That's why we're in the. I think that's to some reason why they're in the mess we were in now. Again, like, it's really, really complex, though.
Well, the one thing that we've had many disagreements on value versus money, and
That's a good way of putting it, actually.
and one thing that I just laid down, is the one thing I always love talking to you about, because we don't agree, and that's one thing that I appreciate about you, is you forced me to think and grow.
And vice versa.
But the one thing that I laid awake, in one of my bouts of insomnia, is we had this talk about, what happens in plenitude economy when you have automation going and producing a lot of your everyday needs, but there'll still be scarcity no matter what. You'll always have only so much lakefront property. You'll only have one Mona Lisa, and then you'll have the artisans and the specialists of the world that are going to go and create these crafts and these goods that people are going to really sought after. But the more that financial system hyperinflates, the less value money actually has. But that doesn't mean that there's not some sort of value associated with the particular item or service that a said individual is providing. So I think that we're I'm trying to really wrap my mind around it.
I'm the same way. I'm wrapping my mind around the idea that a great deal of our basic requirements will be met, and what will that do to us? It's all I think about when I've been listening to this book. It's all I've been thinking about. What happens when you do that? Mm-hmm. What happens when you meet your requirement for all of the spatulas? Like when all of a sudden most of the things you need are suddenly available to you in your own home. Mm-hmm. And we know neither of us are fooling each other. We both know that there's a lot of theory, and thinking more than 10 years, 20 years out is a dangerous place to be, because of the fact there is so many variables involved. But there is undoubtedly this sort of decentralization of production. That's definitely going. When I mean, like, things like the ability to produce things in one's own home, the internet, and the coalescing of all information has given that to people. The guy who had no engineering background can build a hydro-powered thingy-majig in his backyard, pull a solar panel up in his back thing. Production is decentralizing. And
Encyclopedia Britannica is not making $5,000 per set of leather-bound encyclopedias anymore with the rise of Wikipedia.
Absolutely.
Meridian is not selling dictionaries. I mean,
it's decentralizing.
Become free, but that doesn't mean that we're not associating a value with it.
But it's a different kind of value. I think it's a different kind of value. We are taught in this country, in Western society, that all value is about what you're getting back from it. But there's a different type of value for things. There's all sorts of different types of value. There is an economic value. There's a communistic value. There is... I feel as though that I remain ardently a capitalist, because I think in the same way that I remain a constitutionalist. I like the idea of the Constitution. I remain a capitalist because I think at its very core, capitalism is a democratic element. I think capitalism gives people the ability to be able to exchange goods back and forward in what could be closely kind of considered to be in a democratic and even an equal way. Now, it doesn't mean that I back the kind of capitalism which we're seeing today, but I do see capitalism day to day. I see it every single day. A guy takes $5 and goes into his local grocery store, and the guy in the grocery store, who's usually of a different ethnic background, because if he was of the same ethnic background as the person coming in, he'd probably give him a bunch of discounts and never make any money. So it's just the way it goes, right? I mean, that's why you see that kind of change and that kind of thing, because there was a wonderful little analogy that I read somewhere where the guy was like talking about this tribe, and if you're in that tribe and it's almost impossible to say no to someone, and as Americans and Westerners look at that and go, but this is mine, I will hold on to this, it will belong to me. If you have enough and you have a surplus of an item, that surplus will quickly become diminished because that will go to the general idea, the general tribe. However, some things like oxen, which their kids are taught from a young age to live and die for, are never allowed to be bought and sold. So they still apply value to things, and they won't apply those sort of discounts or values to outsiders. It has to be inside if you've proven yourself to some degree. But that works fine when you've got 300 people. But when you have an economy, like involving hundreds of millions of people, you need to have a common ground on value to some extent, which is illusion. It's definitely illusion. This $5 bill I have in my hand is constantly shifting in its value, but it's the closest thing I've got to be able to go into a place and go, I need milk. You know, I don't want to go in there and go, well, as an IT guy, I can do IT services for you for just enough to make that IT money back. So to some extent that works, but that's a very far cry from like hedge funds and futures and the kind of shit that's ruined entire sways of people's lives.
Well, and I think that's one thing that you and I have had trouble wrapping our brains around, and that I think the general populace is also generally struggling with, is that just because that money is sort of losing its value doesn't mean that the product or the said capital that is there doesn't lost its value.
I mean, every single
like,
time
a loaf of a piece of bread is still going to be worth 110 calories, whether it cost you 25 cents or whether it cost you $10. There's still a caloric value associated with that you need to go.
If you ask our
sustain
parents,
yourself.
like, how much is a loaf of bread during wartime, we know that's a shifting value. We know gas is a shifting value, and we look at it and go, how can a gallon of gas is still a gallon of gas? And like, no, it isn't. It becomes harder to get hold of. Then there's prospecting going on involved in it too. Tax price or removes price. Sometimes prospecting and subsidies help us. Sometimes they fail us. What I find really interesting, though, is just going back to what you were saying before, I've been trying to wrap my head around the idea that when our basic needs are being met, and this is still hypothetical, but maybe at some point or other, with 3D printers and a decentralization of information and all that kind of thing, you eventually get to the point when you eat enough and you get your basic commodities met in terms of, like, I don't know, I need to make a cup. Okay, it makes a cup. And let's say the 3D printers, there's no saying that they won't get as advanced to be able to produce something that looks absolutely like a piece of wood, you know, and then you can put that piece of wood and make a chair out of it, you know, like there's no, we really can go as far as you like with it, and there's no saying it wouldn't. It's all molecules in the end, right? You just make them, and if it figures out how to make them, they'll make them, right? So, like, right now they're making resin, but that would have been unheard of 20 years ago, and before that, 20 years before that, and so on, and, you know, like, it's incredibly interesting, exciting.
We're getting, as we mentioned before, we hit record on down here. We're getting to a point where they're making vat-grown steak, bacon, and, you know, beef. You know, actin-myosin fibers grown in chambers. The implications of this is absolutely astounding, right? I mean, how many farmers are going to be completely and totally out of work? How many truckers that are moving cattle? How many people working at slaughterhouses? You know, that doesn't mean that meat has any less of a value, because, you know, 10 strips of bacon still probably has a caloric value of 500 calories. It has all the macronutrients of fat and protein and, well, probably a small smidgen of carbohydrates in it, but it doesn't mean that it's worth any less to you. However, the value and the implications of the overall socio-economic scheme, I mean, it's huge.
So what will happen then? That's what I'm trying to wrap my head around. Because we're making a leap by saying, we're where we are now, and then we always make this leap. I think our disagreements are always, I feel that a lot about this, our disagreements are always based around the same principle. We're where we are now, and you provide something way out. And I go, whoa, 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 hang on a minute. How do we get there? So that's where we get the disagreement, because you're like, no, this is how it could be, and this is how it is, and this is the problem we have now. There's a giant gap in between, and the giant gap is the transition. Mm-hmm. So let's say, for example, theoretically, that we have this idea in our mind where our basic commodities is met. There's a whole bunch of changes that will happen at the same time in society. Think about read any news article. There is so much shit happening at the same time, it's hard to say where anything will go. But let's say, just hypothetically, there is that. What would happen to the guy working in a slaughterhouse? Like, how would he make his money? Like, and I'm not, like, saying, you answer that. I'm saying, like, how do we answer that? So, you're right. So we decentralize. Smaller communities then get the technology to be able to make their own meat, for example, right? So do we look at, like, the idea that we break down into smaller communities then? What would happen to cities?
I'm asking questions not like I expect you to answer them, but that's the kind of things that are floating through my head. Like, what would happen to urban centers? Would we have like a growth in gardens? Would we have production of these things coming back to cities and not being these things in the middle of Oklahoma or in these large areas? Where if you could make meat in a factory, then making meat in a factory, you could do that anywhere, right? You could do that, and if you could make money from doing that and you could make better quality stuff from doing that. If you do that in your own factory, you could do that in a city. So, is that coming back? Is that good for cities? Bad for cities? And there's so much stuff to think about. Like you said, I have difficulty wrapping my head around it because it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's inevitably going to happen. We're going to get to the point where 3D printers are advanced enough to be able to give us anything we want right there and then. What now? Well, how does that look? Do we have massive
your
upheaval?
whole question is predicated on what the guy will do to go and get his money.
Yeah.
It's
that's
and I
true.
think that's really where you're getting into a conundrum. It's not that the things that are being produced are worth any less, but the value of the money, there's less placed on it. And every time that you have quantitative easing or you print more money and there's more of it in circulation, the value of said money is actually lessened. However, the value of the capital or the goods that you're trying to attain have not dropped in value.
Well, that's a really deeper question then. What happens? Do we still have a currency then if we can produce? I mean, we have to say, what would we produce? Would it be a society where everything but the most specialized items would be available to anybody, in which case we wouldn't buy and sell?
That's a question that I've been chasing for about 8 or 9 years, and the closest I've actually found to is one individual who lives in Venus, Florida, Najat Fresco of the Venus Foundation. He lived through World War II, and is like a young lad in World War II. He just looked around as all these factories just shut down, and people were hungry, and they weren't able to go and make cars or horseshoes or tires and all the things that they needed, simply because the financial system that we associated money with quit flowing and working properly. However, all of the goods and everything that truly had the value were just sitting there in the idle. The iron was still on the ground, the oil was still on the ground, the apples were still on the trees. However, the shift of the money was not there. So what the heck happened? Why aren't the people going out and picking apples and pumping oil out of the ground in a communal fashion for the better of society? And he said, really, what would happen if we were to go and engineer a society that was predicated on the value of goods rather than the value of money? Because he pointed out many, many times in almost 80-something years now that money started out representation of resources, where now it's treated actually as a resource, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we separated ourselves from its origins, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So what happens when we go back and we sort of have a plenitude economy, and we can no longer really work because everything is automated? I mean, automated cars. Tesla Vehicles is talking about having automated cars to market in 3 years.
So
to market.
Yeah, so the idea that there would be people to be able to produce those themselves, would everybody want to produce their own vehicle? Would you still centralize? I'm not talking about, you're right, the sticking block for me is always the element of money, so let's continue down this hypothesis and say we remove money too. Would people produce their own cars, or would you rely on a person within your community to specialize in making that? You just had a larger 3D printer, which made from, the 3D printer itself, by the way, made from smaller 3D printers.
Well, right. But I mean, if you were to go back and look at the predecessor of the 3D printer, it was the mill, right? A metal mill could go and, if you were to go over to our makerspace where they had all the metal milling machines, you can go and use these rudimentary tools to replicate and reproduce all of the machines that are in that entire environment. 3D printers are taking that 3 steps further, and they're able to go and truly automate the process. There's currently a Kickstarter going on right now where a guy, for 100, if he hits his goal, his product he wants to bring to market is a 3D printer that can interface via USB or FireWire, a 3D printer that is also capable of actually scanning an object from 2 different angles and replicating it. And he has like all the way through the alpha and beta prototype stuff.
Right, so he can definitely do that.
For $125. But the implications of this is that if you were to go and get rid of money, right, because most of the work is being done, people will still have hobbies, right?
And a lot of times, like people like you and I who aren't married and don't have kids, we don't work to go and sustain our families. We work to sustain our hobbies and our interests. We would still go and we would still write. We would still go and make really cool things, be it costumes or writing or even just getting into widgetry, right? We would go and try to make something better because it helps our quality of life. And people would still keep pressing on. And the fact that the notion of ownership is changing, I mean, you'll still have scarcity where people will want the Mona Lisa, they'll want the David statue, they'll want the oceanfront property, but it's not going to be as relevant. It's still going to be sought after.
Mm-hmm. I think it works well. Like if you remove in societies that don't have money, there's a much more of a communal aspect to these things, and so you will share a lot of things we don't now. But because we live in societies that are millions strong, it's hard to be able to maintain social structures that big. So we might devolve back into smaller groups, which would be able to support that kind of reciprocal behavior. Other than that, I don't know how you would really want to be able to say, well, how you wouldn't have, like, taking the oceanfront property or something like that, you know, an object has a lot of monetary value on it on its basis of facing a lake, which is a really interesting thing. You take something as black and white as money, and then you apply its value to something which is just pleasurable for an average human being. People are willing to pay a lot of money to be able to open their eyes in the morning and look at a lake. And look at a lake from a high area too, you know. And like, how do you monetize that? Well, they monetized it, and it moves all the time. What happens if you didn't monetize that? Well, there's not enough lake to go around for everybody to have that. And if we want happiness, would we share? Would we exchange? Maybe. I mean, you're right. So if we don't have, additionally, we don't have money, we don't have the concept of ownership in the same way we do now. Where would we be? I mean, I think one thing that we're seeing is if average goods can be acquired very, very easily, you're going to watch a lot of big box stores going away. But I think you could say the same thing about the mills too. So what's going to happen then? Maybe information will become currency. Templates. I mean, I always said that. You know, whenever you talk about this stuff, I always think templates. Like, it's okay to be able to take a cup and scan it from 3 sides and have a cup, but you can't do that with a cell phone. But if you turn the cell phone into something that's less complex and put the software and data out there and allow people to make their own circuit boards and be able to produce their own phones, like that phone thing we saw on as the what's it called now, box phone or whatever it's called, which is a really fantastic idea. If you're able to do that with a computer, and don't forget, like, it's only been like 5 years, 10 years from when we went to a one person who could understand how a one phone works to how no individual person on this planet knows how one phone works. So many different teams come together for the touchscreen, for the memory, and that's the thing. Things are becoming so much more complex. 3D printers are going to have to move in that same vein. So templates, I'm using that as an example because I think about, there's a book called The Diamond Age, I think it was called, by Neil Stephenson. It's fiction. He talks about a future where these 3D printers, and he gives them a different name, but they essentially can produce things from blocks that you put in them. Blocks of raw material.
Star Trek called it the replicator.
Yeah, exactly, same principle. And what people did was they manufactured tens of thousands of these tiny little nanobots, which they go out and the psychopaths release them on neighborhoods they didn't like. And they go out there and, you know, clog people up. And it was a really, really cool idea that the police force then had to create their own. Because you create these tiny little robots that if you put in a microscope could move around and get into your nervous system and fuck you up. Because there's also miniaturization. You know, we're talking about replicating spatulas. We're talking also about replicating tiny little organisms and things like that, tiny little moving robots, right? So they'd have these days when you'd know there'd be a fight, because if you looked really carefully, the nanobots from one side would come in, maybe like a racist group would launch their nanobots that were specifically designed to attack certain people of a certain ethnic demographic, and they would release their own, and there'd be a battle. And you'd put a thing over your mouth and it'd get black with the corpses of these billions of dead nanobots, which would be spewed out continuously. If they can do things like that, then what would be more powerful than having a physical object? Well, physicality doesn't mean anything to us anymore. So as I was thinking about this is where I'm going with what I was thinking about. What do you have when physical objects no longer mean anything? When physical objects can be produced and reconstituted and recycled with just a press of a button, right? You know, I don't like my spatula. We talked about having millions of spatulas. Well, why bother? Just take the same spatula,
with the adjoining machine, which then takes the material you're putting into it and breaks it down to its component parts and shoves it back into the 3D printer to spit it back out again as a spatula you liked in a better look. What's the importance of physical objects anymore? Well, what will become important, I believe personally, the trade is a fundamental process of human beings, and it's not based on scarcity, it's based on interaction. So what will we trade in? Information, data, decentralization. We don't look at our books anymore. We don't see our music anymore. We don't see our money anymore. We don't see our movies anymore. Everything is digitized. So what becomes powerful now? That's why BitTorrent is such a threat, because all of a sudden you're open sourcing it. There'll be a fight for a while between big companies, but they're gradually realizing the value of BitTorrent, gradually realizing the importance. People will pay for what's convenient. And Kevin Spacey did a fantastic speech about the success of House of Cards and also Arrested Development. He said they didn't release them one episode at a time. They released the whole episode at the same time. That was groundbreaking. No one else had ever done that before. That this is what people want. They want to sit down and watch effectively an 8-hour movie. If they want to. If they don't want to, they can stop it whenever they want. They want that choice. So what's going to happen with that? Like, where do we get to that point?
Right.
I think...
But, expounding on what you're saying is, do you know how Netflix actually found its success? Is watching torrenting habits. They don't know what intellectual property to buy.
They fucking watch the top 10 on Torrent Freak.
What's being torrent and how people are actually torrenting. They realize that people aren't torrenting one episode; they're getting one season or the entire discography
I read about
or
that.
Entire collection.
That was a TIL in Reddit. They were like, they watch Torrent Freak for the top stuff, and they order their movies based on that principle and watch that. And it's a very good business model. I imagine in 10 years' time they'll be guilty of stagnating like the rest. But right now they're on the crest of a really interesting model. They're going to do very, very well. I think what's interesting then is that the information and data no longer becomes important. I'm not ready to say that we'll move into a trade-free environment. And trade requires standards.
Well, but I mean, I think the notion that we have to get over is that you can have value without money as long as your value isn't placed on money.
I think I think if you were going to call this, I think something I might like to coin for both you and I think we're in the midst of what we might consider to be a value renaissance.
I think that's a very fair assessment.
I think what we're looking at is a period of time when value is being totally redefined and reanalyzed. Mm-hmm. That when you can use a device such as a laptop, and through that laptop get everything you could have ever needed on it 50 years ago, but in one spot, the laptop becomes important. What happens when the laptop doesn't become important anymore? What happens when you can produce a laptop? It's only going to be so long before someone can produce a series of circuit boards of complex variety, get hold of the templates to do it, produce the plastics around it, make a nice, rather probably a nasty looking laptop, but produce a laptop of sufficient complexity that would be able to run whatever you want. And once we get that, then the objects cease to become important forever. What then becomes important? And also, don't forget, our movement into our computers. I mean, we start off with a computer in front of us. We move to a phone that sits on the side of our head. The next one's going to be attached to our wrist. The one after that's going to be attached to our faces, and the one after that's going to be inside our brains. So what happens when we start moving within the information that speed?
Transhumanism, which is something that we've also talked a great deal about.
Mm-hmm. That's insanely exciting. It's
incredibly exciting. And it opens up the doorway to whole immortality. And a lot of other things, I mean, really.
I mean, why not? 100 years, 200 years out, I don't think that's impossible at all.
Yeah.
So what then? How do we trade? How do we interact? Societies will still matter, but not for the same reasons.
Societies will matter, but I mean, if you were to go and get rid of money, Jacques Fresco, and there might be flaws in his numbers, but he theorizes that we would be able to eliminate 95% of the potential workforce. If you think about it, it would really be broken down to bare bones governmental bodies. It would be necessary police forces for crime of passions and to deal with people who might be serial killers per se, and mental health professionals, right? I mean, and everybody else would pretty much be on a voluntary basis. I really, really like clean water, so I'm just going to volunteer my time and help fix this filtration system because the automated system isn't covered.
I don't know. The problem I have with that is because I think people will still strive to innovate. When information becomes so freely accessible, people's jobs will look totally different. Jobs or employment or voluntary, whatever they're doing, their tasks on a daily basis will be totally different. The idea I think what Jack Fresco is doing in his mistake, and I use this term loosely, mistake, because I think he's foreseeing something in terms of the loss of the importance of physical items. His mistake is that physical items is where it's at. What he's forgetting is it's no longer where it's at. Physical items no longer matter, but what did we replace it with? Digitized items. Everything is digital. So, and I want to repeat that. I don't think it's a weakness. I just think it's based on his life. He looked at everything being physical. We're moving into a period of time when things are becoming decreasingly physical. We remember a time when things were on tape, when things were on a disc, when things were on a little cartridge, and when they disappeared entirely.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we remember that as our generation. There are people being born today who will never know what a cassette tape is, how stuff used to be digitized, how stuff used to be reduced down to a physical object. So I think what he's looking at is going, well, when you move the physical objects, you remove a lot of different elements of society, whereas what we're seeing, when you remove the physical objects, you don't see a transference, you don't see a loss of envy, a loss of desire, you just see it transferred into a digital world. You try to see it happening so much quicker, and that's where it gets beyond my capacity to really be able to foresee what's going to happen. But
Well,
maybe we'll move into a completely digital...
Well, something that, two things that you talked about or you brought up that you just said, I really don't have an answer to, and I'm not going to be so daft as to say that I have the answers as well. But I will say that I've had some time to go and think about some of these things in quite a lot of detail. And again, I don't have the answers, but I have conjecture and hypotheses of ways that we could go. And also, other like monkey wrenches that are going to be thrown in there. One of the things that you brought up is intellectual-based capital. We're getting away from commodity-based capital of bartering goods, and we'll start bartering and bartering intellect. But what happens? Ray Kurzweil brought up the theory of the singularity, right? Eventually, in the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years, we're going to hit a point where computers are going to start out-thinking people.
Okay, carry on, sorry. That's a very exciting idea because I have opinions about this too. But
Right, but I mean, at that point, intellectual-based capital starts to lose its value at the same exponential rate that commodity-based capital did.
You don't mind, do you?
I'm still kind of lost. I don't know here.
Carry on.
Reading fake chicken.
Fakin.
Bacon. Better than fake meat, which sounds
Actually,
like feet.
It's not fakin because that would be fake bacon. It's fakin
Fake meat. Feet.
for chicken. I don't know.
We're eating feet.
You-
But at that point, even intellectual-based capital starts to go and lose what we had the value that we would go and associate with it. But we will still contribute to society just out of sheer boredom. I mean, what are we going to do? Our mere existence starts to be questioned.
I think that I look at this person's background when I think about the kind of predictions they make. Kurzweil is a futurist, and his idea is to make things which sound sensational and that kind of thing. My issues with what he's saying, because I read The Singularity is Near, was that the idea that we would eventually hit this point when computers would outthink us. He ignores the fact that as fast as computers are increasing in intelligence, it's as fast as our interaction with computers are happening at the same time. I think his singularity he's talking about when ideas are taken, expressed, and implemented immediately, is based on the idea that we will somehow be surpassed by computers. I think there is the freak chance that there will be one step of the ladder that we're behind, and a machine will become artificially intelligent. That brings up a whole bunch of questions of what is intelligence. It would probably not look like nothing we know. It would be modeled on us as we know it. And if it's modeled on us, we can depend on the fact that we've already put it in our heads. And we will become the machine. So when the actual thing happens, we will become indistinguishable from our machines. In the same way that we have moved closer and closer to our tools, and closer and closer to our processes and that kind of thing. I don't think that we'll be a bored civilization. I will totally disagree with that. I think as a species, we will just be moving further and beyond. Every stage will generate a whole different, I'm going to say the word economy, but I don't necessarily mean in the form it is now. Every epoch in society has generated a new way of thinking, has generated new things to pursue, new ideas, new ideologies, new religions, new things to work for. And we might move to the point when we decentralize
Earth. I mean, the ultimate decentralization is space travel.
Get off this mud ball.
Absolutely.
I mean,
And
we
what
only
will
have
people
5
do?
billion years left before the whole
I know.
Milky Way is
Better speed up.
eaten up, you know, and
The ultimate decentralization will be that basis. So when our resources become infinite because we start tapping into things like the asteroid belt, then we are tapping into even further than that. We become a solar-based species rather than the terrestrial-based species. Then we're really going to look at the idea, well, what will people work for? Well, we'll re-articulate. We'll start becoming explorers again. We spent 50,000 years developing the technology to move from one body of water to the other. But then we spent 500 years developing the ability to be able to traverse overland by means of aircraft. Now we're looking at the ability to be able to traverse away from our planet as it has and have like independent moon colonies. Then all our technology will need to make sure that we can set up manufacturing plants wherever we go to be able to replicate the environment we need. And I say that like we'll even need that environment. We might not. We might be so involved with our machines that the oxygen will be replaced. I mean, the science fiction I read, Warhammer 40,000, talks about a full circle, coming back to the point where strength it matters again. I kind of find that attractive, the idea that after all the technology we spent, we still develop superhumans who are capable of punching your head through a wall. The reason for that is because when it comes down to it, that's what humans are. I disagree with it, but it's an interesting thought experiment. When it comes back down again, what we're going to have people who are going to want to explore. People are going to take them and their families and get on a ship and all the manufacturing capacity and start going out. That will be the path. I don't even think we're going to be reduced to a nation of pastimes. I think we're going to work harder than we ever have.
I have to completely derail this conversation.
Don't you think that's exciting, though?
I think that's amazingly excited, but you totally touched on something that gave me a geekgasm like a week ago. All right, so check this out. There was a medical study that was recently done on it was based on linguistics, but it ended up getting into like brain biology and neuronic activity, right? And the whole study was based on...
I just want to say, by the way, neuronic is a word that John just created.
It is. I got it from George Bush. It's very strategic.
When I forgive this on the basis of John, when someone has as good as a grasp of the English language as John does, he gets to create words like neuronic. So I just want to say that.
If it's used by pop culture as a whole, it ends up getting added to the dictionary, and I'm right, you're wrong. My grandmother once told me that ain't is not in the dictionary. I can't use it. Now it's in the dictionary. I love you, but fuck you, Grandma.
Let's not start talking about language. We'll be here till tomorrow. But carry on. You were saying anyway.
So, language, right? You talked about the ability to go and interface with machines inhabiting faster than others. Well, recently they went and did this medical study, and it was more based in linguistics. People who had an initial native language, say you were born in France, learned French, it was your first native language, but you moved to an English-speaking or an Arabic-speaking thing, and over the next 30 years you predominantly went and think in that other language. Do you have linguistic memories? Like when you think of your childhood, do you all of a sudden revert to that other language? And do you automatically go switch over in the language that you think of? And they turned out when going and studying the patterns of the brain that the neuronic pathways. Yes, I'm coining this word. It is mine.
From now on.
Neuronal pathways. Neuron. Brain. Neural. Yes. Sorry. Are actually language neutral.
Oh yeah, that old question. If you're bilingual, what do you dream in?
Yes. They have gone past the point of hypothesis and now have theories and are mapping the human brain to the point that they know that all linguistical memories are actually language neutral, and that there's something that goes to another portion of the brain.
As is John language neutral for creating a linguistical word as well. That's another word.
We are coming up with a new language called John.
Showing his theory and trying to do it in a form, and really like championing this idea of language neutrality by creating his own words whenever he damn well feels.
Well, like 10001000000.
I like my flesh
I
voice.
just told you to fuck off in binary.
Damn it.
Okay. Ha 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 ha. No. But the
yeah.
point that I'm getting at is that they feel that they're going to go and tap this new study, and it's going to be the new way to go and interface via wet wire with machines.
That's cool.
Since they've mapped these neural pathways and that they're starting to understand that it's language neutral and that there's another portion of the brain that translates that to a language, that they can circumvent that portion of the brain, expediting, I think that's a word as well, the transfer of data with the machine. And to further complicate things, I mean, how the brain currently works is you have these neuronic, I like that word, neural pathways that then go to another portion of the brain that are translated into languages, that go into muscle and everything like that, and then you type into a keyboard. By the time you actually go and use the keyboard, you are like seconds, if not like forever behind where your brain actually is. And the speed that we're going to actually go and communicate with machines is going to be exponentially
This is
faster.
this is where I'm a big proponent of capitalism, right? You know, at heart, I'm a space freak, right? You know, I've actually calculated how long I would choose. You know, after going to what is the period of time I would allow being in space before I would be happily be executed? You know, 10 minutes for the record. I would go to space for 10 minutes and then happily die after that. There's two things that are really interesting about that. Number one is that one of the things that are really interesting about the the private sector in terms of space travel is the private sector are willing to do things with pilots that a government won't. A government won't do things with pilots because there is an element. If we were to turn around and the average government would say, hey, look, we want to send someone to space.
Mm-hmm.
We want to send someone to space, and they might not come back. What government would take that on? Only China at this point.
Maybe Russia. Just
maybe,
right.
But certainly the biggest. I mean, in America remains like by far the largest space, the propagator of space exploration. So, but private sector, no such problems. There are people, and it links into another thing. When this SpaceX space plane, I think it's a space plane, it might be Virgin or something, are offering flights for $200,000 to go up into space for a limited period of time when their space plane, which they have, they do tests on people. And they found, first of all, two things. First of all, that the average body, they've run it, they do the what do they call it, the G testing? An 80-year-old, the body is far more resilient than they realize. An 80-year-old did it fine, got up to 4 Gs fine. The days of space travel being something only performed by specialists in the same way that original sea travel was only performed by specialists and is now performed by anybody. Obviously only competent professional sailors are allowed to do this. Now, the most fittest and healthiest and most intelligent of our astronauts are able to go up and do this stuff. Now, people are looking at people doing it who are anybody. The youngest person was 18, the oldest was 80, and they survived the Gs necessary to make it up. Everybody has to do these testing. In fact, my favorite actor, Brian Blessed, did 6 Gs for 45 minutes, which said even the Russians wouldn't do. So he managed to survive that, but there's actually seen some cerebral hemorrhaging from it, but interestingly enough, but off the side of that. What's interesting is the fact, because like spaceflight is becoming so much more available to so many more people now, what I think so exciting is the fact is the private sector takes that over, they're going to do things that people won't. For example, if there was a neural brain imaging and connection like wetware system, they would find a private person to do it. The SpaceX or whoever the company was said the amount of one-way ticket requests they get is unbelievable. People want to go up there with terminal illnesses and they don't want to come back. There are enough people out there who are willing to do this because the private sector will offer that. There's no political standing behind it. They don't care. It's money as far as I'm concerned. But it's not money. It's innovation. Money is the tools by which to do it. After it becomes commonplace, then they'll make money from it. They make enough to get by. But this innovation is not available in the public sector in any way. So they're looking at people saying, well, if you get to that wetware interface kind of stuff, what better people available to it would be people who are confined to a wheelchair, for example. I wrote a story about a lady who was paraplegic and was basically non-functioning apart from a finger movement below the neck. And then they interfaced her. Her name was Heather. They interfaced her with a computer into the spaceship. And it was slightly in the future, so they extended her lifespan. And then she was able to provide that human interface to be able to make decisions that computers aren't able to, based on variables they can't predict, to go to places like Titan and start putting down probes. And they gave her the ability to be able to euthanize herself, which is also another social element which I predicted would become a commonplace in 10 years, 20 years down the line. So I put all those things together in the story, made it happen, and Heather went up in the spaceship went to Titan over a 5-year period and started putting down probes and coordinating everything whilst being fed nutrients and while being completely well taken care of by the machinery that's around her, using her brain. Everything was from her brain. She was able to make decisions. What's more is when something went wrong with a space mission, she was able to correct it right there and then and send the information back, make repairs, all sorts of things. You know, what better way for people who are disabled for some reason or another, or people who have very good minds but not good bodies, to perform? And it's been my long-standing feeling when we get over the idea of our sort of obsession with an individual's look towards the stupidity of aesthetics, we will consider that if it's putting an arm on ourselves is a good idea, an extra metallic arm, rather than waiting for it to be blown off in a war zone, more people will do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hopefully we'll move beyond aesthetics and silly like concepts of beauty.
So what happens, right? Like, generally when any superorganism gets to a certain size, there's generally fracturing that happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
France, Britain.
I love the fact that you just were like, it's like that thing I heard today. It was like, I have two things in life. I don't believe anyone should be. There's two things I hate in this world. First of all, judging people on their cultural predisposition, and Danish people.
So,
You just
yeah.
said France and stopped. I was just like,
well, like
okay.
Napoleon took over.
I
a
agree. We
large
should send
portion of
France
the
to the
north.
moon,
But it fractured and fell apart. Britain did a horrible, wonderful job. You know,
we
like
weren't the only ones. The Belgians,
currently
Belgians, and the French.
gotta
and
clean out
Germans.
those neuronic pathways.
Those neuronic.
Yes, and currently America. You know, we've approached where Britain got, and where France got, and where Germany got, and where Mongolian China got.
That's true.
With their
Like,
1,500 something megabases.
it's like what
and
John
their-
Stewart said. You know, better do as we say, or we'll open up a can of police action on your ass.
That's right. Bring in democracy.
Can't wait till the world says, I'm good. I'm going to go with my sort of
Oh,
weird
God.
communistic... Sorry, I totally interrupted what you were saying. So you were doing a what if.
So the point that I'm getting at is that you bring up the private sector over and over and over and over and over again. At the end of the day, a collective of any smaller individuals that are functioning towards a common goal is a superorganism, whether they're public or private, a religious institution, a government institution, or a financial institution. They're striving towards a common goal. They're a collective of people. You were to break it down on its simplest level, that's really what it is.
Yeah.
And superorganisms generally arise when there is a separatist culture, when people aren't going towards a common goal, and generally other people going in differing opinion, different goals, or they're just slackers in the system, right? It's how ants push out non-workers in a colony or kill them and eat them. It's how wolves push out other wolves that won't hunt. It's how also people who have separating ideas go to deal with the situation, dude. How religious wars, blah, 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 blah. However, when you address scarcity, ideologies, and religious differences, there's not as much competition, and again, we get rid of the superorganism and we become back one, which is sort of coming back full circle to what I sort of see happening with the notion of the state and the corporation, is that we're getting so big that we're starting to see fracturing.
Oh, I mean, definitely. I mean, I agree. We're going from a point where you're having massive demographics such as Catholics and Protestants. That's where we left off, by the way. Catholics and Protestants, eventually moving down to like subgroups and religious groups, sub-religious groups, to the point when you can now, like you said, connect with someone across the internet about, like, you know, I consider myself a conservative aluminum pot person. You know, like I camp in this particular way, and I also like to do ballet, and I only want to talk to people who do that. Yeah, definitely, I agree. But I think those demographics will shift. I don't think they'll go away. I think competition is a valuable thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be competition at the expense of. There's a really great part in the show The Wire. We sell drugs, he says to this other guy. That's all we do. Why do we have to kill people over it? Has anyone ever asked that question? Why do we have to murder everybody over it, kind of thing? The point I'm trying to make is competition is a valuable thing. It doesn't have to be at the expense of someone else. It can be the idea of like of a stepping stone, not on top of one another, but because of everybody else. And I think the only reason we've lost sight of that is because our societies have got so big.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to think about where our food comes from and who I should thank for creating the alphabet I now use to speak of. A good example is where I work. I'm not going to use names, but where I work right now, they want to do long hours. I told you about that series of long hours I did. Now, if I was doing 18-hour shifts for SpaceX, I would have absolutely no fucking problem. I would be given every hour I had, and that would be my life. I would do that all of the time. But because I'm doing it for something which is a less than savory element of the legal field, one of the things that the people in charge forget about is that in order to motivate their staff, they're going to have to employ something else. How do you motivate people when you're in a sort of less than savory, insert the blank element of the legal field? How do you motivate people? They're totally separating themselves from what the firm is doing. What they're saying is getting those computers out there on the day I was supposed to do them is more important. It supersedes anything that's dependent on, if that makes sense. Like money being in the similarity, like money being something which is like an artifact or a symbolistic nature of something else, something that it represents. In the same way that, like, my boss says, okay, I need these 30 machines out, and this most important thing in the world to you right now. He motivates me on that basis, and I look at a broader picture and go, what does our legal firm do? Nothing of value. None of this really matters. I don't want to do this. But in his mind, in the CTO's head, what he says is that's the most important thing. That's entirely hedge funds and all these different things. Like, they don't look at the broader picture. They don't look at what they're putting back into society or anything like that. So there's an idea, if this makes sense, there's an idea that the private sector doesn't have to be a corrosive element. A capitalist capitalist, I use the term because of capital, but the capitalist private sector doesn't have to be corrosive. It can be incredibly powerful and a really good a force for good, for innovation where the government lets off. I talked about this with Patrick a couple of weeks ago. How cool would it be if for the next 50 years the private sector entirely handled mid to low orbit movement of products for a cost, enough to cover their cost and also pay for innovation, and also to make a small profit, which they can then share amongst their members. And then the government, which has the largest capital still, for the now time being, focuses on mid to high to outer orbit exploration. What a wonderful symbiosis between private and public. I have a contract. Here's $200 million. What a wonderful idea. How wonderful would this be? I have $200 million. Which one of you fuckers out there could do this for $200 million or less? Can you imagine having that contract? It was something that came up the other day. When it comes to other countries, when they approach their healthcare, for example, we have decentralized our healthcare into so many different component organizations now that they don't have to worry. Now we can buy each other out and create monopolies. In England, for example, they go out there and they say, okay, replacement hips, here's the contract. Which one of you guys can do it for less? You get to make the replacement hips for every person in this country. Now fight amongst yourselves, and I'll take the lowest bidder. And then they produce that lowest bidder, and that's how it goes. And they scrupulously work with those guys to make sure they produce. That doesn't happen here in this country, which is why healthcare care costs are way out of proportion. So the private sector can be a really valuable thing, provided you have money and all that. So I'm moving away from those hypotheses we're talking about. It doesn't necessarily promote corruption, not in and of itself.
It doesn't necessarily promote corruption, but what we have is the private sector and the public sector have a revolving door, and at least in America. I can't speak for every country, but I can't see it being horribly different in every other country.
I don't think it is. I think it is pretty commonplace.
And really, the laws that are there to go and protect the free market to keep it remain free are a lot of times taken over by the bigger corporations, hijacked, and they pass laws or manipulate laws or play off loopholes in laws to lock out competition. You know, Apple is a perfect example of that. They make a fabulously wonderful phone. However, they don't own the shape of the rectangle, nor do they own all things that are
I mean,
square.
you're right. It's totally true. It's like the idea of it going way out, it going to the point where it's totally unrealistic. It's just ridiculous. However, private sectors, when you use the term good, I'm going to use this term very loosely, can necessarily, as an organism, your superorganism you mentioned before, can be something which isn't entirely corrosive. There's a funny thing in News Quiz. They said a little while ago, they said, Google has this mission statement, which is don't be evil. Interesting. He said, as opposed to their previous mission statement, which was search things on the internet. That's what they do. They search things on the internet. When a company comes along and starts talking about don't be evil, it means they understand that they have a moral obligation, a societal obligation, to do things the right way. Because they're involved in things that is new territory, involves private elements of people's lives, which they never would have thought about in the beginning of their days. And when Google started, they said, we want to produce a search engine. We think we can make money because we'll sell advertising to small companies and we'll do it intelligently. They never realized they would end up running the social mechanisms which control entire sections of people's lives now. What you search on the internet, what you like, who you like, what you don't like, and all those sort of things. There's a moral element there. And we look at those companies like Apple and Google and we go, holy crap, you have all this power. People freak out. Privacy laws. We go like, we need to define our privacy laws. We don't even know what privacy is anymore. It's totally redefined. It's totally changed. It's not what it used to be 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. So Google has this like power now. They created, by using existing technologies, social environments that never existed before. And now we're going along and go, oh my God, you have all of this control. You can tell everything about you. You can totally destroy me as a person if you chose to. What do we do with you as a company? And Google says, don't worry. Our mission statement is don't be evil. And we're good with that. We're good with that. We're good with that to some extent because we say, look, you made an obligation to your society, to your large demographic, your superorganism. You need to pay attention to your larger social environment. Why? Because if you don't, we won't give you money anymore. And Google might, at their heart, have an ethical element. We'll never know. Who can say? It's made of people who are ethical. Made of people who have moral systems, value systems. When you put them together in a superorganism, it's a bit like when I go to work on Monday morning. And I'll go in, as I do, I go into the sysadmin's office and I complain bitterly. And I say, the actions we're taking today, if performed by an average individual, would be considered clinically insane. But as an institution, it takes on a different morality and all of a sudden acceptable. If I have to hear someone say the thing they want to say and I repeat it back to them and I say, you want me to do this thing which is inefficient? I just want to hear you say that. Okay, I'll go ahead and do it anyway. Fine. But if an individual was to have that sort of attitude within that work environment, they'd be considered insane. Why did you do it the wrong way? Well, what do you mean? As a society, we do the things the wrong way because it's accepted. And like we give all the idea like corporations have somehow some sort of like moral obligation to do the right thing is such a strange idea to me.
Well, and that's one of the reasons that corporations, the private sector, work so much more efficiently than the public sector is because they sort of rid themselves of morality and of bureaucracy. Well, not rid themselves, but it plays down to a lesser extent. I mean, really,
this is so fascinating.
The corporations, at the end of the day, a CEO only has fealty to the bottom line. End of story. And if that CEO, they might say, my motto is don't be evil, but their return on investment to their shareholders is really ultimately that matters. And if that return to that investment is not there, then they kick him out and they find a new person who's going to go and give them a greater return. It doesn't matter whether he's petting puppies, as long as that helps the bottom line.
What happens if that CEO justified that in his mind of saying, I need to maintain the bottom line because I need to produce jobs? Now, I'm being hypothetical. I'm not defending the CEO. I'm not saying the guy... I think that's what he tells himself. I really do. Reality? No, I don't think he gives a shit.
No,
I don't think he's a psychopath either, though there is an interesting correlation between psychopaths and CEOs, which studies have shown, but that's beside the point. He's like you said, his allegiance is with the bottom line. The bottom line represents success, and the success represents, to some people, jobs, but for them, like you said before, they've separated themselves from the ultimate ideal. Here I am thinking that installing computers is the most important thing in the world because someone told me they are. But when I look at it in the broad scale, societally, who am I working for? Jesus. You know, like, nothing I'm doing matters. And even if it was for something that matters, it matters even less because of who we represent. I mean...
Well, and that's, you know...
But the idea is that we expect governments to be moral, we think corporations shouldn't be. But we look at corporations like Google, who have a freaking societal obligation to be moral because of the kind of control we give them. We give it to them. They don't have anything without us. But governments, we say, no, you're moral because we elected you. But we kind of elected, by the dollar, these corporations too. And what they do with that is huge. And that's... I think that's what I was saying before is so exciting about this, because we're looking at these corporations who, for example, used to produce steel and basic commodities, now produce digital identities.
and so there's a moral element that wasn't really there before. There's always been a moral element with commerce. There has to be a moral element with commerce because, like I said before, markets are states, states are markets, states being societies, there has to be a moral value to producing steel, even if you're just producing jobs for your people and you give them payment incentives. But when it comes to things like controlling digital identities, which no corporations really had a handle before, this is like a 10-year recent phenomenon, when all of a sudden selling a product, I was looking at it so obtusely for the past 20 years, I was looking at things and going, well, they're selling identities. What are you talking about, selling identities? I buy an Apple Mac, I'm not buying a computer, I'm buying an identity. I was being insanely obtuse. What I needed to look at was going, they don't sell identities, they control my identity. My identity is my digital identity is everything to me. It really is, as much as my social identity in the real world. The internet or the outranet, however you look at it. So they control that now. They have all that information, they use it for advertising purposes and things like that, which I don't mind. But oh my god, think about that power. We are moving into a world where corporations have unprecedented power, and we're talking about decentralization. Why would Google ever need to decentralize?
Well, we're also moving into a world where the general individual has unprecedented power. For the first time ever, an individual can go and take a camera that's capable of incredibly high resolution, combine it with a microphone that cost him under $200 with an incredibly high resolution, run his video, go and pirate software that cost him absolutely nothing and process it on a computer that he only spent a couple $100s for, and compete with a multi-billion-dollar corporation that puts billions and billions of dollars into it. In effect, the individual now is capable of, in some level, putting out a product that can go and compete with a corporation, and corporations displace the state, and I'm going to say the state rather than the government, because the government is the body that I feel that, as you kindly put it, fills the potholes, changes the light bulbs, and gets the psychopaths off the street, right? The politicians are the people that we have problems with because it's the policies that govern the government or, get everything put into motion. So I refer to it as the state, which is the superorganism, the total collective of people that have a representative government, the private entity, which is the corporation. But now the individual is capable of going and competing with this. This is something that is new, literally within the last 10 years. But it is taking off by leaps and bounds, and nobody knows how to go and deal with it.
That's true. At the same time, that adds the idea of the individual's value system being the dictator of their actions in many respects. You're seeing a lot of bigotry on the rise kind of thing, But look at, if you look at Warren Buffett, for example, who tends to make pretty intelligent decisions when it comes to business. If you told him 50 years ago, I want you to take all this money, I want you to put it into a company that deals primarily with advertising on this system called the internet. And what it'll do is they will buy and sell, they will provide services in exchange for propagating advertising. That's what they'll do. If you actually look at what the internet is, they will buy and sell, they will allow people to have services where they I keep using those words, they will move photographs of things that they do. Photographs will become huge. People will need to prove they're at any given event all the time. No one will believe them if they won't. They will need to prove and expend their identities in a digital way, and this company will make money from it. And what's more, they won't just be advertising physical objects that exist in the real world. They'll be advertising other digital elements. What's digital? Well, imagine when something doesn't actually exist. And you want me to invest how much money into this? No. Now, when we're looking at corporations and whenever the politicians come out and promote the importance of manufacturing, and they go, our manufacturing is down, but they never talk about the digital elements. Google, Apple, Sun, all of the big corporations that deal entirely with the digital world rise and fall, but gradually are replacing that of manufacturing. We look at manufacturing being important. We look at the physical objects. Are you kidding me? Give that to the other countries, fine. Give it to the other countries who are moving up and that kind of thing, the smaller countries that look a lot like we did 200 years ago and that kind of thing, and give them that kind of stuff. And give them the physical production and make us an entirely service economy, entirely technical economy, where digital power moves. Makes this current generation very, very shaky, very, very unstable. I love to say, when people say, I don't get to see my money anymore, you never did. What do you think that piece of paper that says 5 on it really means? You've never been able to see your money. What do you mean money? You've never ever visualized what you make. How could you? How would you visualize it? Well, we have the system of currency, blah, 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 blah. But people say virtualize is just a couple of numbers on a screen somewhere. How is that any different from the chit you're holding in your hand? And that kind of thing.
And that brings up something that we've talked about many a times, and we sort of agreed on, that nobody really wants $500,000 a year. They want the quality of life that they associate with $500,000 a year.
Yeah.
You can have $500,000, but if you're strapped on an island, you can't eat it, you can't fish with it. The only thing that you can do is maybe, if it's in a physical form, burn it to keep warm. It really.
And even then, it wouldn't last very long. It's one of the things that I used to love when I was a kid, and I realize I'm really happy that I moved away from this. The quote was, "Only when the last tree has been chopped down, the last fish has been caught, or when the last, grassland has been ruined, we realize as a populace that we can't eat money." Now, when I was a kid, that appealed to me a great deal, but then I learned a lot more, and I realized, actually, if you have no fish to pull and no trees to chop down and no landscape to look at, what you can do is use that money to pay an underpaid individual who you exploit to bring in that grass turf from wherever you bought it from, and a nice lakefront property, and the food you no longer have in your own environment, and you can have that for you and provide that for you. Well, that's what money represents. But one of the really interesting things about House of Cards, which I'm watching right now on Netflix, is when he talks about what people decide to do. He says, someone he just spoke to, he said he decided to take money and not power. He said, I loathe people who can't tell the difference between the two. Essentially saying that I pursued power and I don't get paid very much for it. He pursued money and that's what he wants. It makes you happy. But he pursues something else. There's a human element there. I have full expectations that Kevin Spacey's character in that thing, if he wasn't in politics, would probably be a serial killer, murdering people in the scope of his character. But I'm kind of getting off topic.
I think that's a fair assessment. It doesn't matter whether you get off topic. I mean, in reality, we're going on like an hour and a half, 2 hours on this recording. We might have to cut it up, or just have some really patient listeners or whoever.
Well, not even patient listeners. I think it's just going to be nice to have
trip.
this as a nostalgic thing to come back to.
Yeah,
but I
really
think
do.
in terms of like what corporations do and companies and that kind of thing, there's this element which, when you said this, it really struck a chord with me. You said something about the government and the corporation, which we both know is, we're not talking about corporations, we're talking about business, the economy versus the state, the markets versus the state. Let's even be even more reductionist. We apply moral systems to the state, which we do not apply to our markets. But I say that they are one and the same thing in many different ways. We just give them different names. That the market fails heavily when they move away from basic humanity. By humanity, I mean association with an object to a thing, and by object to association to a thing, the person who pulls that thing out of the ground for you, that's where they fail, and they will continue to fail. And the state is not morally, it does not have a moral obligation to be just. Whenever the Constitution made a mistake, whenever the government made its mistake in relinquishing control of the justice system to the state, to say the differences of right and wrong, whenever they gave it over to a corporation in terms of digital identity, and when Rockefeller Corporation got involved back in the union disputes in the 1800s and that kind of thing, all this stuff is when corporations were saying, I'm a market, I'm emotionless, I'm dehumanized, but I'm going to tell you what to do with your life. I'm going to tell you what to do with your body. Now only Google and Apple and IBM and HP, only they have the right to do that now because they really do control digital identities. But back in the day, they never could. And corporations started lobbying. This is all organic. It all makes sense. It makes perfect sense. It's not, people get annoyed about it. Why? It makes sense. Of course, steel producing corporations are going to lobby government to make sure that they can maintain their fields where they get their equipment and the resources from. It doesn't make it right.
Yeah.
It just means that, like, governments look like corporations and corporations look like governments. And that's always been the way. What the most exciting and most interesting thing is that I can see, which is, what we and I have talked about, is the idea that power comes back to the people in the form of technology. I just hope that as things become more and more and more complex that we get, such as this phone I'm holding up, that we have the ability to reproduce this. Because if things keep getting more and more complex because of their massive R&D divisions, I really hope we can reproduce this with 3D printers as fast as they're making it. Mm-hmm. Because that's a lot of money involved. That's one of the good things about the private sector, is they have the kind of cash flow to be able to produce these insanely complicated things, which the average person doesn't have access to. You need teams of people to do that,
What's the matter, Sharon?
People are dead that I didn't want to be dead.
What are you watching?
I'm playing a
Video
game.
Oh.
This lady, she was murdered by a samurai.
What?
And her boyfriend, who's my like homie, like tried to save her, and he like fought the samurai. I didn't know he was so good with swords, but apparently he is. But then he got stabbed, and maybe he's dead too. And I'm really sad.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Is this all on San Andreas?
Saints Row.
Saints Row? Yeah, that.
Yes.
I've got to pee.
Tragic.
Thanks for sharing.
What? If you just left the room, you'd think it was offended. You and I have come to like this.
Do you want to pause it?
First, I don't mind. It doesn't matter. First,
6 o'clock.
Have you been drinking?
I'm gonna walk to 7-Eleven, which is 2 blocks away.
we might not
Would you
even
like chips and guacamole?
We might. I'm good. I mean, we might not even stay in this evening. Right?
We could all go
Oh
out
my God, it's
today.
11:15.
Or you wanted chips, or you wanted
Baby,
snacks?
you don't have to leave on my accord.
I'm sad about my fake friends, so
You want chips and guacamole?
I don't know.
I'm
I
good
just-
for food. I really am.
If you want to go to 7-Eleven, would you like... Here, let me give you this.
No, it's alright.
I know it's alright. Here, take this.
Making it rain for the kitties!
You did not just make it rain on my cat.
I made it rain on your cat.
Asshole.
He lives here for
He
free.
doesn't know what to do with that.
Here,
It's not covered
get
in...
like drunken munchy food for us.
Okay.
And, yeah, be safe.
Okay. I'll try not to get into all the gang fights on the way.
Well, if we were in Uptown, I would probably say you shouldn't be doing this. But that's where Daniel lives, and that's
Well,
not
yeah.
safe.
Well, we don't live in Uptown. We don't live in Stabby McStabby neighborhood.
In Shooty McShooterton.
It's to you. It's Stabby McStabberville. Where I live.
There's actually a neighborhood in my game called Shivington.
Should we get more? Hey, Cheryl, wait, let me give you my credit card so you can get vodka. Because we're almost out.
Yeah. Do we don't want to go out tonight?
Do you want to go out?
I don't know. I feel like I kind of want to see the world for a bit. Do you want to go out?
Should we go out?
What do you feel like? What? Well, I am dressed in my finest ball gown, but
Oh,
yes,
look
I
at me
Yes,
in
you
my
are.
hoodie and my running shoes. And
Shut
you
up.
know the difference between my outfit and your outfit is I'm wearing shorts and you're wearing ripped jeans.
I don't know. I'm not against the idea. It was like I kind of feel like seeing the world, but would be totally fine with being here too. It's cheaper here.
I would be really, really cool with going out had there not been a whole bunch of people in bars that I don't want to talk to.
With who?
Bars.
Who's in bars that you don't want to talk to?
Every bar that I go to, there's people I don't want to talk to. And just
Oh yeah, because John is an attractive gentleman, right?
I've
And
noticed. I've
We
noticed his
we,
face.
we go to bars and John compliments to you, sir. By the way, is the idea is you to like try to have the conversation be civil, and you always get the drunk asshole strike up the conversation with you. What? It's true. You get a drunk asshole having conversations with you, and you're like, "Yeah, I'm here with my friend, and I'm gonna have a conversation with my friend." And they're like, "Yeah, pat, pat, pat. Let's have a conversation."
Are you being facetious?
No, I'm not. I'm defending you. I'm like,
Okay.
them. See, this is my problem, right? I always come off as being aggressive and contentious, and I'm not being that way. I'm just like,
Are you being sarcastic?
no. I was like totally defending John, like John having to deal with the drunk asshole because John looks approachable, whereas I turn around and go,
And
you
you
know.
look like Dexter, so no one wants to talk to you.
I
Especially
take
if
it
you
as a
like
compliment, actually.
Yeah.
thermal shirt and your like gloves in the winter.
Yeah.
And you, when it's cold and brisk, you walk really fast and you're on a mission. She's like, you're like, and you have this look like, get out of my way or I will cut you. Yes,
Not too far from
Daniel Dexter.
So I think we should go somewhere, at least for one, and then we can come back if we want to. A nice friendly bar, like I don't know.
Should we go to Spy Bar?
Oh,
Is that close?
Yeah.
No,
It's not.
It's not the official
real
Spy Bar.
It's a bar that we call Spy Bar.
Is it fun?